Thank you for watching the recording of the Women's Caucus webinar that was presented on December the 16th. This webinar features 5 of the Women's Caucus highest scoring abstract award winners from the 2020 APHA annual meeting. Please note that you can find the presenters' bios in the description section of this recording. Our first presenter will be Dr. Mellissa Withers. She'll be presenting a work titled Using Trauma-Informed Approach to Improve Services for Sex Trafficking Survivors. She is the winner of the 2020 Women's Caucus Highest Scoring Abstract Award.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And what fantastic work. I'm honored to be part of this group. So let me go ahead and get started. So as Michelle mentioned, the title of my talk is Using a Trauma-Informed Approach to Improve Services for Sex Trafficking Survivors. So just a quick background, there are 21 million victims of trafficking in the world. About 1.5 million of them come from the developed countries like the US, European Union countries, Australia, and of course this does not include people who are in forced marriages, which is a whole other topic. And in terms of the United States, the victims of sex trafficking in the United States are 94% female, 75% US born, 88% minorities. And you can see there whether they're involved in child sex trafficking, 41%, 48% adults, and 6% sexualized labor. We also know that there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to sex trafficking in the United States, and those include refugees and asylees, immigrant and migrant workers, runaway and homeless youth. And we see this a lot in the work that we do here in Los Angeles, that many times youth who run away are approached by a potential trafficker within 48 hours of leaving home. We also see a disproportionate amount of sex trafficking among LGBTQ plus individuals. Also in the work I have done here in Los Angeles, we're seeing an increasing number of people with disabilities, including a visual and hearing impairment, as well as survivors of other crimes. And we know that survivors have an enormous amount of barriers to overcome in accessing services. And these include kind of systems level barriers like not having insurance, not knowing where to go to get help, but also lack of knowledge, sometimes that they're even victims of a crime of trafficking, manipulation, so psychological manipulation, shame and embarrassment and stigma also often prevents them from seeking help, as well as having a criminal record, which I'll talk about more in a second, and a lot of mistrust and fear. So that's the background to this study. We received a grant from the state of California to develop a coalition of 3 agencies in Los Angeles. And these agencies typically serve domestic violence or intimate partner violence clients, as well as at-risk youth who are homeless. And these agencies are Covenant House, Saving Innocence, and 1736 Family Crisis Center. So we formed a coalition, and I was part of the research team on this. And the 3 objectives of this study were really to look at the barriers that sex trafficking survivors face in accessing help, to characterize how their needs may be different from needs of domestic violence survivors, and also to create and evaluate a new service model. So what changes could we make at the agency level to better address the survivors' needs. And so I conducted focus groups and interviews with 33 people at the 3 partner agencies. These included 21 residential care managers, so shelter managers, case managers, the 1 assistant director, 1 outreach coordinator, and I also talked to 3 clients. And what we found in this needs assessment kind of first part of this was that some practices at these organizations were actually serving to exclude sex traffickers from accessing services. And so some of the practices that were problematic were, first of all, they were asking a lot of questions in the intake. So if someone called into the tip line, they were asking a lot of kind of eligibility or screening questions. But these questions were serving to discourage people from seeking help because they mistrusted. They also were offering or had a practice of picking up clients at what they thought were safe locations, like police stations. But survivors and clients were saying that actually this really inhibited people from reaching services because often they have had problematic relationships in the past with police. And so not wanting to go to a police station was a barrier. They didn't want to be picked up there. Another practice was requiring them to have ID and TB tests in order to join the shelters. So often sex trafficking and trafficking survivors in general may not have IDs. They also often excluded those with pending charges or criminal backgrounds. And we know that many times it's the sex trafficking survivors that are being criminalized, that are being arrested and charged and prosecuted for prostitution charges. And so many of the clients actually had criminal backgrounds. And then finally, as a protective measure, many of the shelters had rules about not having any contact with a trafficker that lived within a certain geographical location or a certain distance from one of the shelters. Well, that really excluded a lot of the clients because they had traffickers and had been victimized in many locations all over the city. And so that left them with really no options. So we also found that many sex trafficking survivors really came to the agencies in crisis. And so the staff at all of the agencies talked about the difficulties in having a blended shelter. So having domestic violence survivors and sex trafficking survivors in the same shelter was quite challenging. Also, having an emergency shelter versus transitional shelter, that also created some challenges because the emergency shelters really were focused on crisis management, and they didn't have a lot of services like psychological counseling, et cetera. Whereas the transitional shelters, the main focus is more on providing services and getting them into housing. But most human trafficking survivors are coming directly from the street. And they're not coming from another emergency shelter where they're then, referred to the agencies where they've been able to kind of decompress for 45 days or whatever. They were really in crisis mode. And they were especially sensitive then to triggers. So some even talked about movies being shown as being triggering. They often were isolating themselves, they didn't want to talk to any of the other clients. They had difficulties relating to the domestic violence clients because they felt like they were being judged. They really kind of mistrusted the system as a whole, and had a lot of anger issues. They had a lot of difficulties in getting along with other people in the shelter. And so it really was, again, difficult to try to blend those two groups together. And then the other kind of main problem was the rules in the shelters. So sex trafficking clients often had difficulties with these rules because they tend to reject anything that makes them feel like they're being controlled or they're giving up some of their autonomy. And so the shelters for protection had rules like curfews. They had emergency safety holds where a client, once coming in, couldn't leave for like 72 hours. They had to relinquish their cell phone at the beginning during these holds, and they had, staff monitoring, but it was really because of safety problems. But it made the sex trafficking clients really feel like they were relinquishing some of their power, and it kind of triggered these feelings of re-victimization due to this loss of autonomy. And so it's really important to appreciate a trauma-informed approach and how important it is. So trauma-informed care involves recognizing the impact of traumatic experiences, especially violence and abuse, on an individual's life, on their behavior, on their perception of themselves and their bodies, and really recognizing and appreciating that exposure to violence can cause them to be extremely mistrustful, sensitive to and vulnerable, and really kind of this unpredictability or lack of control really made them sort of overly sensitive to these rules, and they needed to regain this sense of safety, of dignity, and of control. And so again, we know that the impact of trauma, it manifests in different ways. It can manifest through things like PTSD, where they have recurrent nightmares, easily startled or feeling withdrawn. It can also have memory disruption, or even, trauma bonding or loyalty to a trafficker, or returning to a trafficker. And there are many different factors that influence how trafficked persons express these reactions to traumatic experiences, and they're unique. They're not all the same. So they may manifest as anger and hostility and irritability, or as withdrawal or kind of being zoned out. And so trauma-informed care then was implemented, and they went back and trained all of the staff to incorporate into their routine practice an appreciation of how traumatic experiences affect the client's behaviors. And so they really focused on providing information, informed consent, and encouraging people to ask questions, and also to respect their individual autonomy. So these included new protocols. So for example, the screening questions for human trafficking were included in the intake forms, but they were not overly, they did not ask a ton of questions. They just asked kind of a minimal question or two. They also realized that they needed more sustained outreach for trafficking victims in particular. They needed to go out and reach them and to establish relationships that the trafficking clients who are out on the street would know that there was a place to go when they decided to seek help. And for those that left, to know that they could come back if they changed their mind. So there was a lot more flexibility in terms of the rules. They incorporated single rooms at the shelter specifically for trafficking survivors that were coming out of crisis. They implemented sex trafficking specific counseling with a lot of success, and also knowing that basically they needed to include clients even if they had a lack of ID or pending criminal charges, those kinds of things. They also, as I mentioned, changed their services. So they realized that they needed specialized services and very comprehensive care for sex trafficking clients. They often had substance abuse issues. They needed legal services, job placement counseling, really intensive, tailored case management on a long-term basis. And so they decided to reduce the caseload of some of their case managers because of the intensity of the work in working with these clients. And they also, as I mentioned, trained shelter staff on things like call clients by their names, never call them honey or sweetie, because it may bring back bad memories of their experiences. They also told them to, not take things personally. These clients may be angry or withdrawn or not wanting to talk to you, but it's because of their trauma. So that staff needed to be patient and empathetic, but also transparent. So explain the necessity, explain the benefits in terms of safety. Why are these rules and protocols in place? And they also really gave their clients space to decompress and to develop trust before they started trying to ask them a lot of questions. So they really appreciated that this new model would help avoid re-traumatization and would improve retention of clients. And that's actually what it did. I also just wanted to touch for a minute on some resources that are available for others who are wanting to do similar work. So the National Human Trafficking Resource Center has a lot of resources and capacity building. There's a trauma-informed code of conduct that was developed by the Helen Bamber Foundation, which I found very useful. And also relationship building tips by the Health and Human Services Adult Human Trafficking Screening Tool. Again, the Human Trafficking Resource Center provides guidance and as well as local resources, as well as Look Beneath the Surface campaign, which includes downloadable off their website, pocket cards and brochures, posters, all of that. And there's also a SOAR training, and they specifically have modules for trauma-informed care and also for public health, social services, behavioral health, and these are all free online trainings. And finally, I wanted to mention that I write a blog on Psychology Today on human trafficking called Modern Day Slavery, the Psychological Complexities of Human Trafficking. And I talk more about this, as well as my work as an expert witness and on criminal cases. And finally, if anyone would like to reach out to me, there is my email. So thank you so much.
Our next presenter will be Martha Grace Cromeens. She'll be presenting her work titled A Systematic Scoping Review of Timing Delays and Pathways to Diagnosis of Endometriosis. She is the winner of the Women's Caucus Highest Scoring Student Abstract Award.
So first, I just want to thank Dr. Williams, the APHA, and the Women's Caucus for putting together this important webinar and the opportunity to present our research. We are honored to be here with so many great scientists doing important work in women's health and public health. And our work is titled A Systematic Scoping Review of Timing Delays and Pathways to Diagnosis of Endometriosis. And I definitely want to recognize my co-authors, Victoria Peterman and Doctors Erin Carey, Whitney Robinson, Kathleen Knaffel, and Suzanne Thorey. We have no conflicts of interest to declare. So endometriosis is the existence of the endometrial tissue exterior to the uterus. It is estimated that it affects approximately 10% of reproductive age women, which leads to a calculation of about 200 million women worldwide. And despite extensive research and progress, women with endometriosis, which is a chronic gynecologic condition, continue to experience prolonged delays in diagnosis. One study mentioned here looked at research sites across 10 countries and revealed an average delay of 6.7 years across the sites. And this is consistent with delays found around the world in other studies, anywhere from 3 years in China or Brazil to 11 or 12 years in the United States. During that delay, women must manage the growing burdens of disruptive physical symptoms, such as chronic pelvic pain or CPP, menstrual irregularity, infertility, pain with intercourse, and painful bowel movements, just to list a few. They also suffer psychosocial symptoms such as social isolation, uncertainty, anxiety, and depression. Endometriosis and chronic pelvic pain are associated with increased central pain amplification and decreased pain thresholds, which may result in a decreased response to treatment. This is just saying that the longer you have pain, it's been shown that patients can end up with pain amplification, and then it's harder for them to respond to treatment. To the knowledge of the researchers, there is not currently a systematic scoping review of the current scientific literature of timing delays and pathways to diagnosis of endometriosis. A better understanding of factors contributing to diagnosis delay is needed to develop interventions aimed at shortening delay. As a result, we aim to map current international scientific peer-reviewed and gray literature investigating pathways, timing, and delays of diagnosis of endometriosis. So here you can see our 4-step process in this scoping review. We employed a systematic scoping review method following recommendations from the Joanna Briggs Institute. The study included qualitative and quantitative empirical studies published in English language peer-reviewed journals. We worked with a research librarian to create a search string with variants of endometriosis, delay, timing, and diagnosis. And we searched 6 databases for studies, which you can see are listed here in the first box or column. 2 reviewers independently screened the article titles and abstracts for inclusion or exclusion criteria in the initial screening process. Then 2 independent reviewers also completed the full text review for inclusion in the study. We created a data collection tool through an iterative process and performed pilot extractions. And the included articles underwent extraction by 2 researchers again. At each one of these steps, the reviewers met to resolve conflicting decisions. Here we have our inclusion-exclusion criteria for the studies. And the inclusion criteria were fairly broad, with studies with participants of any age, race, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status, or language. And they just had to have a diagnosis of endometriosis, but that we included that with broad-reaching criteria, including surgical verification, histological confirmation, provider presumed, or participant identified. The purpose or the results of the study had to focus on some element of pathways, timing, or delay. And it had to be an empirical study, but it could be qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, or intervention. From a peer-reviewed journal, gray sources included, so dissertations or other sources, or case study. We did exclude animal studies, abstracts only, editorials, op-eds, or position papers, literature reviews, case reports. If these elements, the pathways, timing, or delay, were just reported as a descriptive statistic, then they weren't included. if the full text was not published in English, and studies concentrating on diagnostic tests or equipment. Here you can see our Prisma diagram. We performed the searches in January 2019 and July 2020. The searches will be performed again prior to publication to be current. And the searches of the databases resulted in more than 1,700 articles. We added an additional 38 articles from other sources. Duplicates were removed, and a total of 1,015 articles underwent screening. We ultimately included 61 articles for data extraction. So as far as results, review of the included articles revealed that the research originated in North America, South America, Europe, Australia, and Asia, revealing the global nature of the problem associated with diagnosis timing. Scientists have studied the relationships between timing to diagnosis and multiple factors, the most common of which are usually the age of the participant upon symptom onset and the specialty of providers first consulted. So were they an adolescent when they first had their first symptoms, or an older person? Did they first go see a general practitioner, or did they see a gynecologist first? Scientists have studied, preliminary analysis also revealed a lack of uniform working definitions for concepts such as delay and pathways. So we don't know, when a study talks about delay, they didn't usually define what they meant by that, how they were calculating that time and what delay meant. Most of the studies did not utilize or develop theoretical or conceptual frameworks. Few studies included diverse samples across race or ethnicity, or they failed to report it. And I have some examples of this. The way that they reported ethnicity or race varied. They could be very limited as far as the options were only, say, Black or white, Hispanic or non-Hispanic. Some studies reported national origin, so they would say Australian-born versus European-born. And then they would just report the largest group, say white, making up 70% of the sample. Either way, if the largest proportion of these samples were reported as white or Caucasian, and even if they reported these, they did not link them to the timing elements. Few studies examined socioeconomic status in relationship to timing to diagnosis, if at all. The proxies used for socioeconomic status, the most common was education, but also household income, marital status, employment, and then some would have a defined socioeconomic class. But again, very few were actually related to the timing. They were just used as descriptive statistics most of the time. So probably the biggest limitation of this study is that we excluded non-English language studies. And like I said, this is a global issue, and there is research out there around the world. And as far as the discussion, although endometriosis and delay in diagnosis are international challenges, this work is delays in diagnosis of endometriosis remains a global challenge. More research across socioeconomic strata and race or ethnicity is needed to understand disparities in time to diagnosis. A better understanding of the pre-diagnostic period among a diverse sample of women will help develop points of interventions for a more timely diagnosis. Our references are seen here. We want to give special thanks to Jamie Conklin, who is the health science librarian at UNC that helped us, Ashlyn Perry, who helped with the extraction of data to our funders, NINR, Sigma Theta Tau International, American Nurses Foundation, the Linda Waring Matthews Research Scholarship, and Hillman Scholars Program in Nursing Innovation. And we want to thank you for your time. Please find us on Twitter or don't hesitate to reach out.
Our next presenter will be Dr. Marie Stoner. She'll be presenting her work titled Sexual Harassment of College and University Students, How Knowledge, Perceptions, and Help-Seeking Behaviors Vary by Institution. She is the winner of the Honorable Mention Highest Scoring Abstract Award.
So thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm Marie Stoner at RTI International, and I'll be presenting some work today on behalf of my co-authors listed here at the University of North Carolina about sexual harassment of college and university students, how knowledge, perceptions, and help-seeking behavior vary by institution. Sexual misconduct has received increasing attention over the past decade at institutions of higher education, or IHEs. But there's been a focus on acquaintance sexual assault, leaving a need for research on sexual harassment in specific. Sexual harassment can be defined as a series of behaviors that interfere with the victim's academic or professional performances, limit the victim's ability to participate in an academic program, or create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive social, academic, or work environment. Sexual harassment may have serious consequences for students and has been shown to be associated with lower grades, less connection to their academic communities, and higher rates of physical and psychological health issues, including alcohol use and misuse. Contacting of campus services by survivors is infrequent. And in a 2015 report by the Association of American Universities, only 7.7% of participants who reported sexual harassment reported the incidents to campus services. 79% of these respondents said that they did not report the incident because it was not considered serious enough to report, typically meaning that they were not hurt or injured in the incident. There are still several gaps in the literature. The first is that there are a limited number of multi-institutional studies on sexual harassment, even though there are large variations in the prevalence of sexual harassment across institutions, ranging from 48% to 62%, showing that institutional factors likely do influence sexual harassment. There's also limited research on survivors' experiences of contacting resources in response to harassment or on variations in reporting across IHEs. The objectives of our study were first to characterize the prevalence of sexual harassment across 27 institutions of higher education, and then to assess relationships at the institutional level between students' experiences of sexual harassment victimization and their perceptions of campus climate and knowledge of resources for sexual harassment. We used data from the 2015 Association of American Universities, AAU, Campus Climate Survey on Sexual Assault and Sexual Misconduct. We included 146,957 respondents from the main campuses of 27 IHEs. We did a descriptive analysis where we examined the prevalence of sexual harassment by IHE, including types of sexual harassment and the perpetrator's relationship to the respondent. And then across IHE, we also examined if experience of sexual harassment was related to perceptions of risk, knowledge of policies and resources, and perceptions of institutional responses to sexual harassment. And then among students who experienced sexual harassment, we looked at if contacting resources was associated with these same measures of risk, knowledge, and perceptions of institutional responses to sexual assault and misconduct. This slide shows characteristics of the institutes of higher education. So 23% were public universities. They had predominantly undergraduate populations, a mean of 64% across institutions. Most students classified themselves as white, and the percentage of sexual harassment varied from 37% to 56% across the IHEs, with a mean of 48% across institutions. The most common type of sexually harassing behavior was inappropriate comments made about the respondent or someone else's body, appearance, or sexual activities, mean of 38% across institutions. And the majority of perpetrators were students. This ranged from 87% to 95% across institutions with a mean of 92%. The percentage who reported the incident was low and ranged from 5% to 18%, with a mean of 8% across all IHEs. This shows the perceptions of risk by experience of sexual harassment. We used 3 different measures for perceptions of risk, which were: I am extremely or very likely to experience sexual assault or misconduct on campus. I am extremely or very likely to experience sexual assault or misconduct during off-campus IHE-sponsored events. And sexual assault or misconduct is extremely or very problematic at the IHE. So for all of these questions, a higher percentage of students who experienced sexual harassment answered yes, compared to students who did not experience sexual harassment. So for example, for the question, I am extremely or very likely to experience sexual assault or misconduct on campus, 9.7% of students who experienced sexual harassment answered yes, compared to 0.9% in those who did not experience sexual harassment, for a mean prevalence ratio of 11.7%. 11.7. And so you can see that all of these are well above 1, which shows that sexually harassed students had higher perceptions of risk than those who did not experience sexual harassment. Then we looked at knowledge of services by experience of sexual harassment. We looked at 4 different measures of knowledge. The first was very or extremely knowledgeable about where to get help at the IHE for sexual assault or misconduct, knowledge about IHE definitions of sexual assault or misconduct, knowledge about what happens when a student reports an incident of sexual assault or misconduct, and knowledge about where to make a report of sexual assault or misconduct. So here, students who experienced sexual harassment were slightly more likely to answer yes to all of these questions than students who did not experience sexual harassment. You can see that the mean prevalence ratios are slightly higher than 1 or around 1 for most of these measures, showing that sexually harassed students had similar or slightly higher knowledge than those who did not experience sexual harassment. And then lastly, we looked at perceptions of the institutional response by experience of sexual harassment. And here we looked at 4 different measures. We looked at very or extremely likely that IHE officials would take reports of sexual assault or misconduct seriously, that IHE officials would conduct a fair investigation for sexual assault or misconduct, that IHE officials would take action to address factors that may have led to sexual assault or misconduct, and that IHE officials would take action against sexual assault misconduct offenders. And here, students who experienced sexual assault were less likely to answer yes to these questions than students who did not experience sexual assault, sexual harassment. So for example, for the question, I am very or extremely likely that IHE officials would take reports of sexual assault or misconduct seriously. 53.1% of students who experienced sexual harassment answered yes to this question, compared to 70.5% in students who did not experience sexual harassment, for a mean prevalence ratio of 0.7, which is below 1, and you can see that all of these are less than 1, showing that sexually harassed students had lower perceptions of the IHE response than those who did not experience sexual harassment. And then we looked at some of these same measures among students who experienced harassment, but by whether or not they contacted IHE resources. So this slide shows knowledge of resources by reporting of sexual harassment among those who experienced harassment. And again, we looked at the same 4 measures: knowledge about what happens when a student reports an incident, knowledge about the IHE's definitions of sexual assault or misconduct, knowledge about where to get help at the IHE for sexual assault or misconduct, and knowledge about where to make a report. And in this case, those who contacted IHE resources were more likely to answer yes to all of these questions than those who did not contact IHE resources. So you can see that here the mean prevalence ratios are all above 1, showing that sexually harassed students who reported the incident had higher knowledge than those who did not report the incident, which makes sense because these are all people who did in fact report the incident. And then we looked at perceptions of the IHE response by reporting of sexual harassment among those who experienced sexual harassment. So again, we looked at the same 4 measures that we used previously. It is very extremely likely that IHE officials would take action to address factors that may have led to sexual assault or misconduct, that IHE officials would take reports of sexual assault or misconduct seriously, that they would conduct a fair investigation, and that they would take action against sexual assault or misconduct offenders. For all of these questions, those who contacted IHE resources were less likely to answer yes than those who did not contact IHE resources. So you can see that here the mean prevalence ratios are all below 1, again, showing that sexually harassed students who reported the incident had lower perceptions of the IHE response than those who did not report the incident. So this shows that actually the act of reporting did not instill confidence in institutional response to sexual harassment. So in conclusion, the mean prevalence of sexual harassment was almost 50% across the 27 campuses, which is very high. It was often perpetrated by other students, and the prevalence varied substantially across IHEs. We also found that sexually harassed students were much more likely than non-harassed students to feel at risk for sexual assault or misconduct, and they had similar or slightly more knowledge about campus resources and services. And lastly, students who experienced sexual harassment were less likely than non-harassed students to perceive that IHE officials would respond appropriately to student reports of sexual misconduct. And sexually harassed students who reported the incident to IHE officials also had negative views of the IHE response and showed that the act of reporting the incident didn't instill confidence in the institutional response. This slide shows the implications for policy and practice. There's a need to create and test interventions specifically targeting sexual harassment, given the high prevalence across institutions. Students need education on sexual harassment, including how to prevent it as a bystander, what resources are available on campus, and definition and examples of sexual harassment. And campus and federal laws and policies should encourage students to seek assistance for sexual harassment victimization and increase student knowledge of available resources, including education programs and victim-centered services. So thank you. I want to acknowledge the 2015 Association of American Universities, AAU survey. And this work was conducted by the UNC Gender-Based Violence Research Group. And you can see our website at the link at the bottom of this slide for more information. Thanks.
Our next presenter will be Dr. Subasri Narasimhan. She'll be presenting her work titled "We Have a Compelling Interest, a comparison of arguments and evidence used by supporters of heartbeat bans in the South." She is the winner of the Women's Caucus Honorable Mention Highest Scoring Abstract Award.
Okay, thank you for having me this afternoon, everyone. My name is Subasri Narasimhan, and today I'm going to present on a study entitled "We Have a Compelling Interest, a comparison of arguments and evidence used by supporters of heartbeat bans in the South." So just a note about terminology before I begin. I will be using the term heartbeat, but that's simply because it's the closest language to the ones used in the legislative debate and in the law. It's not scientifically accurate, and its intention really is to stigmatize abortion access. So that being said, I'll also show examples of legislative debate, and that can sometimes be very upsetting for some people. To begin, in background, heartbeat bans specifically strive to end abortion access as early as 6 weeks gestation. And these bans have proliferated nationally since 2011. However, within public health, the legislative debates which occur around these bans are often reported, but not necessarily examined as public health evidence. And these legislative debates do have an impact on public discourse around abortion. And these debates remain consistently understudied as a form of narrative work in public health. Within the United States, the southern region, including states such as Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, North Carolina, etc., are areas that the Guttmacher Institute has really considered hostile to abortion access, or very hostile to abortion access. That means that there are systematic and numerous legislations impacting abortion access within the region. So in this work, we examined the 2019 and 2020 committee, House, and Senate debate videos from 6 states. Originally, we tried to include 9 states, but these states, 3 states either didn't have a bill that went through committee at the time that we examined the data, or we could not find their debate information, despite it being necessary for them to post it publicly. So these data were transcribed verbatim, and to analyze them, we used MaxQDA 18. We analyzed over 1,000 pages of transcripts ranging from 2 pages to 115 pages of debate. What we did was there was a team of 4 of us, and we created a code book looking using constant comparative method and general meetings to decide on themes that emerged from the descriptions. So we then created what we call thick descriptions to use and categorize themes both within states, so within, for example, Georgia, and across the states. So the main findings here are that we found that supporters of heartbeat bills, and again, I'm going to report supporters here, but we have also analyzed the data of opponents. That's just not going to be presented in these findings. So supporters of heartbeat bills really use disinformation to distort both legal precedent and science, and also to co-opt progressive successes as examples for the reason bills should move forward across states. Within states, we found that they used what we call tailored arguments in order to really sidestep previously unsuccessful legislation or issues that legislators might have with these bills. To dive further, across states, there were 4 claims made. First, they claimed that the heartbeat detection was a scientific indicator of personhood, despite testimony from opponents that full cardiovascular systems were not fully developed at 6 weeks. Secondarily, they positioned the unborn as a protected class of persons that needed to be protected under state law over and above federal legislation. Third, there was an equating of the oppression of fetuses to the oppression faced by Black and LGBTQ individuals in the United States. And fourth, there was a very occasional use of scripture or Christian morality in arguments, something that is interesting because earlier abortion ban research has really documented the use of scripture consistently across states. So now within states, I'm going to highlight specific arguments that were made within states. First, there was Georgia, and Georgia focused really on highlighting the 14th Amendment as the basis for expanding rights, which is the amendment that protects equal protection under the law. So the 14th Amendment passed, this is what a legislator said, the 14th Amendment passed in 1868 gives full legal recognition to an entire class of persons that had never been given full legal recognition before. And that's really exactly what we're doing here. So it was very transparent, the focus of the strategy used to push forward the legislation in Georgia. Within Louisiana, there was a mixture of both legal precedent and some scriptural discussion to argue that denying personhood to a fetus was unconstitutional under the law. A legislator said, treating unborn babies as less than human is really the same sin in many respects as we committed in the crime of slavery, and not sanctioned by God or by law. As you can see, this is again an equating of oppression faced by enslaved persons to that of issues faced by fetuses, if you were to consider them a group. Third, in Kentucky, we found that there was an emphasis on connecting the heartbeat to the audience in very emotional ways. So in order to gloss over the fact that the heartbeat detection actually didn't happen at 6 weeks or even earlier, there was a movement to gloss over the scientific backing and even the scientific committee members' testimonies. So here they would often make very sweeping stories, narratives, or generalizations. Here, a bill proponent said, this bill is to save the lives of the people in Kentucky. Every time their heart pumps blood, every time there's heartbeats inside their mom's stomach, that's what they're saying. In Mississippi, we found that one of the bigger issues that was brought up was the cost of legislating these bills for the state. And so they downplayed significantly the cost of litigating the bills as compared to the cost of the state budget. So here, a legislator said, I think we're going to present you a good budget, almost $6 billion from our general funds coming to you in a few weeks. So I think that if this is what it costs us to defend life, I think we can afford it. And in South Carolina, there was a really clear focus on misrepresenting scientific facts and fabricating statistics. So another fact-based saying is, if the absence of heartbeat indicates death, then logically the presence of heartbeat indicates life. The human heartbeat is an objective scientific proof of life. The reason that they are using this rhetoric specifically in South Carolina, and it also appeared in Georgia, is that there are specific legal statutes in the called the Determination of Death Acts, which outline what one can be considered legally dead under the law. And that includes the lack of heartbeat, but it also includes lack of lung function and brain capacity. And so there was very much just a cherry picking of these kinds of laws. Finally, we saw in Tennessee. Tennessee was a specific law called a trigger law. And in Tennessee, if their emphasis was that if Roe v. Wade was overturned, then they were just simply giving back power to the states to limit abortion. That it was in the state's best interest to limit abortion at the state level and create state-based protections over the federal level. So the trigger law, simply put, means that if Roe v. Wade were overturned at any time by the Supreme Court, that all abortion in the state of Tennessee would be illegal at any gestation. So this bill is protection for unborn children from conception to birth upon a decision of the Supreme Court, restoring the authority to the states to prohibit abortion. So there was a clear emphasis that this was a trigger law. So really, what do we learn from looking at the rhetoric? We understand that this type of rhetoric is meant to further laws and is often very biased. But what we're actually seeing is the emergence of a sensitivity to the ideas of evidence-based medicine and also social justice within some of these rhetorical arguments, something that actually hasn't been captured before in previous abortion legislation research. It's important because in some ways these laws become more compelling when you connect with somebody emotionally, when you connect with their values. And so this is what the intended strategy of supporters for these heartbeat bans are. And we know that once restricting abortion access at this early stage often simply hinders lower income people and minorities within states, and it's also linked to higher rates of maternal mortality, something that is incredibly prevalent in the southern states. So to end, I'd really like to thank the Department of Social, Behavioral, and Health Education Sciences at Emory, the Center for Reproductive Health Research in the Southeast, and the Society for Family Planning for supporting all of this research. I'd also like to thank my co-authors, Christine Cooper, Sarah Anderson, and Dr. Dabney Evans. Thank you.
Our final presenter will be Kecia Ellick. She'll be presenting her work titled Started from the Bottom, Now We're Where, a qualitative analysis of stress and coping among highly educated Black women. She is the winner of the Women's Caucus Honorable Mention Highest Scoring Student Abstract Award.
So I am presenting findings from my dissertation research, Started from the Bottom, Now We're Where, a qualitative study of stress and coping among highly educated Black women. This study was supported in part by our dissertation seed grant from the University of Maryland College Park Qualitative Interest Seed Group. And there are no other conflicts of interest to declare. I'll start by stating that this study was guided by the theoretical frameworks of Black feminist thought and Lifecourse theory, which together speak to the multiple roles that Black women play and the ways in which these roles are negotiated and renegotiated over time, and the cumulative impact of race, gender, and class on Black women's lives. To be eligible, women had to identify as Black American or African American, be biologically female, and identify as a woman, and have a doctorate level degree in their respective field. My final sample size consisted of 24 women with doctorate level degrees and a mean age of 40. Among this sample were educators, lawyers, clinicians, military personnel, and entrepreneurs. In-person, one-on-one, semi-structured interviews was my primary instrument of data collection. These interviews were transcribed verbatim and uploaded to a qualitative software where I proceeded to conduct several rounds of coding and analysis, from which I identified 3 common themes, which I will discuss shortly. Structural and systemic racism and gender oppression are significant sources of stress for Black women. Professionally, Black women can face daily stressors in the form of microaggressions and other overt forms of oppression. In my present study, Monica, a university professor, recalled several instances of students who repeatedly referred to her by Miss instead of Doctor, or addressed her by her first name. Her whiter male colleagues, however, were identified and always addressed by appropriate honorariums. These occurrences would leave Monica feeling angry, disrespected, and that her authority in the classroom was challenged. Eve reflected on colleagues who often shifted in their language when speaking to her to use in more urban vernacular, as opposed to the traditional conversational English they use when speaking to their white colleagues. Eve perceived these intentional behaviors as micro assaults to her race and culture. Rihanna discussed coworkers who questioned her credentials and would periodically review her personnel file to verify its content. In confronting this issue, Rihanna was depicted as angry and hostile and threatening, and later just labeled as an aggressive woman. These experiences left women in a constant state of hypervigilance or feeling constantly on guard and that they couldn't trust their colleagues. Eve stated in the interviews that there was this heightened sense of awareness and urgency and discomfort, and that she was always questioning people's true motives or intentions. Black women are also stressed by societal and cultural expectations of being Black and female that inform their relationships with family and community. Women are expected to marry heterosexually and to bear and raise children. Black women are expected to work outside of the home and financially support the family, provide emotional support to family and friends, and actively contribute to their communities while simultaneously and successfully managing their marriages, children, and career. Through it all, Black women are expected to positively represent their race. These tasks are expected to be performed with a smile and without complaint. Education is a social determinant of health and is widely considered to be a protective factor against negative psychosocial outcomes for women. It is presumed that individuals with higher levels of education have better access to other resources, such as higher household income, better quality of healthcare, and a greater knowledge of positive healthcare behaviors. However, highly educated middle-class Black women experience the same deleterious health outcomes and at the same rates as Black women living in poverty. This suggests that the cost of social mobility afforded by advanced education may result in diminishing returns for Black women by reproducing and reinforcing social inequalities that exacerbate negative experiences. We know that prolonged and repeated exposures to stress can result in physical, social, and psychological impairment. This contributes to the disparate and higher rates of depression, anxiety, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, maternal and infant mortality experienced by Black women. However, when we think about addressing the mental and physical health needs of Black women, we tend to focus on women who are low income, under-resourced, less educated, and less knowledgeable about positive healthcare practices. Less attention is paid to the experiences of those with higher socioeconomic status or to whom possess greater access to resources. The present study answered the call for additional research on the interactive effects of race, gender, and class on Black women's health, and it was guided by the research questions presented here. Analysis of the data revealed a general consensus of perceived social and cultural expectations associated with Black womanhood. However, there was a degree of variance in the lived experiences and coping behaviors of the women in this sample, which contrasts from the literature. I found that women in the present study were pushing back against societal and cultural forces that previously informed their behaviors and jeopardized their health. In fact, the women in the current study were actively working to protect their mental and physical health. These protection strategies emerged as the three things which I present as the findings for my study. Black women engage in two primary reactive coping responses to stress, one of which is the internalization of the strong Black woman archetype. Characteristics of this construct include a constant display of strength, the suppression of emotions, and a resistance to vulnerability. Socialization of these characteristics was passed down from earlier generations of women to younger generations in an effort to negate previously held stereotypes of Black women. While a few of the women in the present study discussed their continued internalization of this messaging, the majority of the sample rejected the narratives of the strong Black woman. In other words, instead of continuing to embrace antiquated narratives of Black womanhood that failed to serve them, these women rejected those stereotypes by redefining for themselves what it meant to be strong. They no longer believed that strength equated to being a superwoman or overburdening themselves with being everything to everyone, but rather their strength was displayed by showing their vulnerability and voicing when they felt overwhelmed, were struggling, or needed help. And importantly, they sought out and accepted the help that was needed. In doing so, they negated the false sense of isolation and that they were alone in their experiences. They understood that it was okay to admit that they didn't have it all together, and that this fact was not a sign of weakness or an indictment of their womanhood. These women secured professional mentors to help navigate adversities in the workplace. They sought out the emotional support of their family and friendship networks, which included cultivating sister circles of other Black women with which they commiserated on shared experiences, they sought advice, or simply vented their mutual frustrations. They also consulted with mental health professionals as needed to help them cope with the chronic stress and acute traumas experienced while navigating their daily lives. Because as Alex pointed out, my friends couldn't provide me with the tools to understand and unpack why I was feeling the way I was feeling and how to deal with it. I needed to go talk to somebody. Identity shifting or code switching is a second reactive coping response to stress, and it involves altering one's appearance, speech patterns or tones, or behaviors to adjust to perceived cultural norms to assimilate and gain acceptance. Black women are socialized into their beliefs about what physical appearances, communication styles, or behaviors are deemed professional or even feminine. Despite any previous willingness to engage in code switching, the women in the present study released cultural expectations associated with being Black and being female, and they pushed back against any curation of their physical aesthetic, any modification of their behaviors, limiting of their aspirations, or quelling of their desires based on the preferences of others. Instead, these women prefer to express themselves authentically and unapologetically. They desire to be more genuine in their presentation as opposed to a less authentic, curated version of themselves. They were no longer willing to mute themselves out of fear of feeding into stereotypes about Black women. For example, they were more vocal about inequities and injustices they experienced without concerns for being labeled as hostile or angry. Moreover, they believed that their hostility and their anger was appropriate and just and stood firm in it. They had grown tired of donning a proverbial and sometimes physical mask in order to feel safe in navigating the world, such as they felt less compelled to conform to cultural expectations about their Blackness or womanhood, such as chemically straightened hair as being the only acceptable option in the workplace. Therefore, they transitioned to wearing their hair in its natural, unaltered texture, or they experimented with a variety of color and styles. They were they engaged less in downplaying of their education, their income, or their career status to attract potential mates or to make others around them feel more comfortable. They felt confident in choosing to prioritize their career and career advancement. And they felt more comfortable in choosing not to partner, not to parent, or neither without apology of those other societal expectations of their womanhood. They felt that showing up as anything less than their full authentic selves in order to conform to societal standards actually created more pressure and resulted in increased experiences of stress. The final thing that emerged from the data was a prioritization of self-care practices. This intentional engagement occurred as women evaluated what they wanted or needed to better care for themselves. Prioritizing caregiving to others above oneself is a core tenet of the strong Black woman archetype. However, self-care as described by the woman in this study emerged as its own unique theme worthy of delineation, and it illustrated the ways in which women protected their health and well-being. They embraced the belief that in order to best be of service to the people they cared about, they had to take better care of themselves. In essence, they had to put their own mask on first. While some of these activities were identified as reactive coping behaviors throughout the study, they have also been identified as proactive strategies against further psychological distress. Women discussed setting and maintaining healthy boundaries and learning to simply say no. They limited who and to what degree others had access to their time, their energy, or their mental, physical, and emotional labor. They set clear parameters around their work schedules and were intentional about not bringing work home so that they can fully focus on other areas in their lives. They also set expectations on the ways in which they allowed themselves to be treated by others and were less tolerant of any maltreatment or disregard. As opposed to overextending their mental and physical energy to the point of fatigue, women allowed themselves time and space to rest and to sleep without guilt. This is in contrast to the ways in which women in general, and Black women in particular, are socialized to place the needs of family, friends, and community above their own, even to their own detriment. Physical exercise was another self-care practice. This included walking, running, cycling, weight training, yoga, and dance classes. Though not all participants had consistent exercise regimens, 5 of the women consider regular exercise a lifestyle. The remaining women expressed the need and desire to incorporate regular exercise and discuss various levels of activity. Consistent with the literature, religion and spirituality were also identified as self-care strategies. Women regularly engaged in prayer, fellowship, and other religious or spiritual practices to maintain their emotional well-being. Lastly, while the literature suggests that Black women are less likely than other groups of women to seek mental health services, the majority of women in the present study supported and actively sought out services from mental health professionals, and they considered counseling and therapy a regular and necessary component of their self-care routines. Among this sample, there was less stigma associated with mental health issues than we typically witness in Black communities. In contrast, seeking help for mental health concerns was encouraged and celebrated. Additionally, this sample of women overwhelmingly expressed a desire to receive therapy or counseling services from Black female providers. This desire was best explained by the words of Sade, who stated, "I felt like I wanted to be able to go into therapy and talk about my problems without having to give the background information of why these problems were important. It's the shared cultural aspect of having someone who looks like me and just understands what it means to be a Black woman in general. I didn't have to educate her on that in order for her to be able to assist." In other words, these women desired a provider whom they believed would possess an intrinsic understanding of the terrains that Black women regularly navigate. This study explored the heterogeneity of Black women and contributes to the body of literature focused on the interactive effects of race, gender, and class on Black women's lives. It provides an empirical data on the ways in which Black women experience, perceive, and respond to stress, and identifies strategies that Black women employ to protect their well-being. Findings from this study have social and clinical implications and may be used to raise awareness among Black and non-Black, non-female groups of the ways in which Black women may differentially experience and internalize workplace and home life stressors. It encourages the routine practice of mental health counseling as a preventative care measure for Black women. It can inform diversity and inclusion programming and trainings in the workplace, and also can inform culturally responsive interventions and therapeutic practices that address the cultural and social factors that contribute to experiences of stress and influence coping responses, such as the support and training of more Black female mental health providers, and ongoing cultural awareness and cultural humility training for Black and non-Black providers. The findings can also be used to inform graduate and professional training programs, which can incorporate information on stress and adaptive coping mechanisms in their professional development content for students. Moving forward, studies can expand recruitment areas nationally to compare and contrast experiences of Black women residing in different regions. As the sample of this study, all were derived from the Southeast region, particularly Atlanta, Georgia. And we can also explore factors that can moderate or mediate the influence of racial and gender oppressions of Black women's health. And while this study was open to women of all sexual orientations, my sample was primarily heterosexual, but it would be interesting in exploring the experiences of sexual minority women and how they perceive and cope with stress as well, and the mechanisms that they use in order to protect their health and well-being. This is my contact information. If anyone is interested in learning more about my study, I had to try to compact a lot of information in a short period of time, as you all can recognize, but I am happy and willing to discuss this further with anyone who is interested. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for watching this recording of the Women's Caucus webinar. If you want to find more information about the Women's Caucus, please visit our website or check us out on our social media channels.